This is not a portrait of a battle. It is a portrait of an ending, carved into the stone of an Egyptian temple over 3,000 years ago. These are the Sea Peoples. The victors wrote the history, and the history says they did this. From Greece to Anatolia to the Levant, the brilliant, gilded world of the late Bronze Age collapsed. Within a generation, palaces burned, whole languages vanished. An interconnected age of trade and diplomacy fell into a silence that would last centuries. And the name given to this cataclysm by the scribes of the only great power to barely survive was this one. The enemies who came from the islands in the midst of the sea. But what if that name is a mistake? Or, at best, a profound misunderstanding? To understand the Sea Peoples, you must first understand the world they supposedly destroyed. By the 13th century before the Common Era, the Eastern Mediterranean was a globalized system. Tin from Afghanistan traveled to Anatolia. Copper from Cyprus was smelted in Egypt. Fine pottery from Greece graced tables in the Levant. Letters between kings, written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language, crisscrossed the sea, discussing trade, marriage alliances, and military aid. It was a fragile web of mutual dependency, but this web was under immense, silent stress. The first stressor was the environment. For decades, cores drilled from ancient lakebeds and seabeds have told a clear story. Scientists analyzed things like oxygen isotopes and fossilized pollen. The data is unequivocal. The region was gripped by a 3-century-long mega drought. Famine wasn't a risk. It was a recurring fact. The sponge of empires was drying out. The second stressor was systemic. This is a cuneiform tablet. It represented contracts, inventories, and debts. The entire economy ran on this script and the complex agreements it encoded. When the drought hit, harvests failed. Debtors couldn't pay. Kings hoarded grain. The trust that greased the wheels of international trade began to evaporate. The system was seizing up. So, picture this world, parched, hungry, and increasingly desperate. The great palaces, those redistributive economic engines, are failing their people. What happens next? The trade networks collapse. The specialized sailor, the international merchant, the royal mercenary, they all find themselves unemployed. Populations begin to move, seeking food, stability, anything. And then the raids begin. Not from a unified foreign empire, but from the periphery, from the cracks in the world itself, from the dried up hills of the Aegean, from the stressed islands of the Mediterranean, from the desperate fringes of a dying order. The Egyptians saw a terrifying alien horde. But what if they were looking in the wrong direction? What if the true face of the collapse wasn't in the strange headdresses of the attackers, but in the mirror? The mystery of the Sea Peoples is not who were these monsters. The real, far more relevant mystery is how does a civilization, when pushed to the breaking point, create its own destroyers? This is a detective story in ashes and clay. A story of climate data, failed systems, and human desperation. A story not of an ending, but of a reckoning. Let's follow the evidence. To comprehend the end of the Bronze Age, you must start at one of its mighty hearts. Hattusa. For over 4 centuries, this was the nerve center of the Hittite Empire, a superpower that rivaled Egypt. Its archives held treaties, laws, and correspondence with every major king. Its walls were thought to be impregnable. And then, around the year 1200 before the Common Era, it was abandoned. Not slowly, suddenly. This pattern repeats from Greece to the coast of the Levant. It is not a regional war, it is a horizon of fire. And in the soil, archaeologists find their first clue, a distinct, thin, dark layer they call the destruction layer. It is a line in the earth separating the vibrant, international, late Bronze Age from the silence that follows. The physical destruction is only half the story. The true measure of this collapse is in what stops. Let's talk about 2 things, writing and tin. First, writing. In the Hittite capital, the clay tablets stop. In the Mycenaean palaces, the linear B administrative records stop. In Ugarit, the diplomatic and commercial letters stop. This isn't just a loss of life, it's a loss of memory and administration. The very ability to coordinate a complex society vanishes. Second, and more critically, tin. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. Copper was locally available in places like Cyprus, but the tin needed to make bronze for weapons, tools, and prestige goods came almost exclusively from distant Afghanistan. Its journey to the Mediterranean was the most critical supply chain of the ancient world. When the palaces that managed this long-distance trade fell, the tin stopped coming. No tin, no new bronze. The technological backbone of these civilizations was broken. A kingdom could survive a burned palace. It could not survive a severed artery of essential material. We have a witness to this moment. A final, desperate message. It comes from the bustling port city of Ugarit in Syria, a linchpin in that international trade network. The letter, baked hard by the very fire that consumed the city, is a reply from the king of Alashia, Cyprus, to the king of Ugarit, who had begged for help. It says, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Your ships are stationed in Lycia, your troops are there, and where are your own troops stationed? The country is abandoned to itself. The country is abandoned to itself." This is the epitaph of the age. It is not a description of conquest. It is a description of systemic failure. The mutual defense treaties were worthless. The network of alliances had evaporated. Each city, each kingdom was on its own. So, the crime scene is clear. Widespread, simultaneous destruction, a collapse of literacy and administration, the fatal severing of critical trade, and a chilling, first-hand account of paralyzing isolation. The question for any detective is now obvious. What, or who, could strike such a coordinated, systemic blow? The easy answer is the one the Egyptians gave: a terrifying, new enemy from the sea. But the evidence on the ground points to something more insidious. It points to a world so brittle that when pushed, it didn't just break, it shattered from within. And from those shattered pieces, the storm gathered. We have one primary eyewitness to the chaos: Ramesses III of Egypt. On his mortuary temple walls, he recorded his great victory, and he gave names to the enemy. He names the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Shurden, a confederation of the sea. His inscriptions tell of a coordinated assault on two fronts, by land and by sea. To Egypt, the case was closed. The destroyers had a face, and these were them. But a good detective doesn't just accept the testimony, they interrogate it. Who were these named groups? This is where linguistics and archaeology become our tools. The Peliset are the most certain. Linguists agree this is the Egyptian name for the Philistines. Archaeology confirms it. After these wars, a new, distinct material culture appears on the southern coast of the Levant. Their pottery is not local. It is a direct transplant of Aegean Greek styles, made locally. These were people from the west who settled in the east. The Shurden are more mysterious. They appear as Egyptian mercenaries a century before the raids. Their name echoes the island of Sardinia, but that link is circumstantial. The Shekelesh name suggests Sicily, but these are echoes, not proof. The Denyayan might connect to the Greek Danaoi, or to the tribe of Dan in the Bible. The evidence is a puzzle with pieces from all over the Mediterranean. So Egypt gives us names, and archaeology gives one group a firm homeland. But there is a coalition, not a single nation. A mob of different peoples, not a unified army. Why would such different groups act in concert? For that, we must look past the faces of the raiders to the conditions that created them. Suspect number 1, the climate. We mentioned the mega drought. Let's understand how we know. When scientists drill cores from ancient lake beds and the sea floor, they analyze two key things. First, pollen types. A shift from oak tree pollen to drought-resistant sagebrush pollen tells a story of forests dying. Second, oxygen isotope ratios in the shells of tiny fossils. More of the heavier oxygen-18 isotope means more evaporation, a sign of intense, prolonged dryness. This wasn't a bad season. This was a 300-year climatic anomaly. Crop yields would have plummeted. Famine was structural. Populations would have been forced to move. The sponge was not just dry, it was crumbling. Suspect number 2, the brittle system. The Bronze Age kingdoms were hyper-specialized and interdependent. Cyprus produced copper. The Aegean produced fine pottery, and olive oil. Egypt produced grain. They relied on each other and on that long tin route. When drought struck the bread baskets, the grain shipments stopped. When political chaos broke the tin route, bronze production halted. What happens to the Cypriot copper miner, the Aegean potter, or the royal mercenary when their purpose vanishes? They become displaced, desperate. They become potential raiders, pirates, or migrants. So, we do not have a mystery of a foreign superpower. We have a convergence of catastrophes. A severe, prolonged climatic shock, an economic system too rigid to adapt, which then fractured. They did not coordinate in a war room. They coordinated in their shared desperation. They were a symptom of systemic failure, who then became a catalyst for total collapse. Their raids were the final, overwhelming stress that toppled structures already buckling under their own weight. Egypt saw an invasion, but we are seeing something far more profound, a societal phase change. The solid order of the Bronze Age, when heated by drought and stressed by complexity, liquefied into chaos. The Sea Peoples were that chaotic, human fluid flowing into the cracks and accelerating the rupture. The verdict is becoming clear, but every crime has an aftermath. What happened to these raiders? And what world was born from the ashes they helped create? So we arrive at the question, were the Sea Peoples the cause of the Bronze Age collapse or its symptom? For 2 centuries, historians have argued this case. The prosecution points to the destruction layers and the Egyptian inscriptions. The defense points to the mega-drought, the failing trade networks, the earthquake storms, the systemic brittleness. But what if the prosecution and defense are both describing the same truth? What if the Sea Peoples were symptom turned catalyst? A world already fracturing under prolonged drought, food scarcity, and economic collapse produced waves of displaced, desperate people. Those people, in turn, became the instrument that delivered the final, killing blow to a system already on life support. This is the perfect storm model, articulated most clearly by archaeologist Eric Klein in his book 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. It is now the leading scholarly consensus. There was no single assassin. There was a convergence of failures, climate, economic, political, seismic, that created conditions so dire that the entire interconnected system simply unraveled. The Sea Peoples did not appear from a vacuum. They emerged from the cracks in the world itself. And their raids, once begun, accelerated the collapse they were born from. It is not a mystery of a single monster. It is a tragedy of a system that, when pushed too far, began to devour itself. So, what became of these peoples? If they were not a unified nation, but a scattered coalition of refugees, mercenaries, and raiders, they did share a single fate, or did their stories diverge? We can trace the palimpsest with the greatest certainty. Egyptian records, specifically the Papyrus Harris I and the Onomasticon of Amenopi, tell us that Ramesses III, having defeated them, did not annihilate them. He settled them in strongholds, taxing them in clothing and grain from the storehouses and granaries each year. Most scholars believe these strongholds were the abandoned Canaanite coastal cities in southern Canaan. Here, the palimpsest established their pentapolis, the 5 cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. They became the Philistines, the people who would, for centuries, be the primary rivals of the Israelites in the hill country to the east. But not all Sea Peoples settled in the south. The Cheka, or Sikils, established themselves further north at the coastal city of Dor. Excavations led by Ephraim Stern have uncovered their material culture, Aegean-style pottery, distinctive cult objects, burial practices, foreign to the local Canaanite population. And the Egyptian story of Wenamun, dating to around 1100 BCE, places a Cheka king ruling at Dor. And in the north, evidence has emerged in recent decades of a polity called Palestine or Walistin, centered in the Amuk Valley of modern-day Turkey and Syria. Its rulers bore names with Anatolian and Aegean affinities. Its material culture shows clear connections to the post-Hittite world. Some scholars suggest this may represent yet another branch of the Sea Peoples, perhaps the Denyen or a related group, who carved out a kingdom in the vacuum left by the Hittite collapse. The Sherden and Shekelesh are more elusive. Their names echo Sardinia and Sicily, but the archaeological trail back to those islands is faint and fiercely debated. They appear in Egyptian records as both enemies and, at other times, as mercenaries in the pharaoh's own army. Some likely settled in Canaan alongside the Philistines. Others may have returned west, carrying with them the memories and technologies of the eastern Mediterranean. We simply do not know. And what of the empires they helped destroy? The Hittites, once the equals of Egypt, masters of Anatolia for 4 centuries, simply vanish. We now have remarkable evidence published in Nature in 2023. That tells us why. By analyzing the growth rings and carbon-13 isotopes in 3,200-year-old juniper logs from the tomb of King Midas at Gordian, researchers have pinpointed a severe 3-year drought in central Anatolia, right at the heartland of the Hittite Empire. Beginning in 1198 BCE, the Hittites had survived droughts before, but this one came at the worst possible moment. Their granaries were already strained, their trade networks were failing. Their vassals in Syria were restless. A 3-year drought in a pre-modern agricultural economy is not a hardship. It is an extinction event. By the 1190s BCE, the Hittite Empire had ceased to exist, not conquered, not replaced, simply erased from history. The Mycenaeans suffered a similar fate. Their palaces burned. Their writing system, Linear B, was lost so completely that the Greek Dark Ages that followed were pre-literate. When writing returned to Greece centuries later, it was with a new script adapted from the Phoenicians. The world of Agamemnon and the Trojan War had become memory, then myth, then silence. And Egypt? Egypt survived. Ramesses III defeated the Sea Peoples, and the Nile Valley remained unconquered. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The cost of the war, combined with a broader regional collapse, crippled the Egyptian economy. The new kingdom, which had ruled an empire from Sudan to Syria, never recovered. Within decades of Ramesses III's death, Egypt had lost its Levantine territories. The imperial administration fragmented. The pharaohs of the 21st dynasty ruled only the Nile Delta, while the high priests of Amun governed Thebes in the south. Egypt would never again be the superpower it had been in the days of Thutmose III or Ramesses II. It had survived the storm, but it was a survivor with mortal wounds. The Philistines, the Peliset, who settled the coastal cities of Canaan, endured for centuries. They became a settled, urban society. They adopted much of the local Canaanite language and culture, though their Aegean heritage remained visible in their pottery, their architecture, and their distinctive circular hearths. They appear in the Hebrew Bible as the perennial antagonists of the Israelites. Their warriors, their gods, Dagon, Ashtoreth, and their ironworking technology made them formidable foes. The tale of David and Goliath, whatever its historical kernel, captures the mutual hostility of two neighboring peoples, each claiming the same land. But no people, not even the victors of this story, endure forever. By the 8th century BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, a new superpower from Mesopotamia, had extended its reach to the Mediterranean. The Philistine cities became vassals, then tributaries, and then provinces. The final blow came in 604 BCE. Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon, having conquered Assyria, swept south through the Levant. He burned Ashkelon to the ground. By the end of the 6th century BCE, the Philistines as a distinct people had disappeared from the historical record. They were absorbed into the successive empires, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, Roman, that ruled the land after them. Their name survived. The Greeks and Romans called their land Palestine, derived from Philistia. That name passed into Arabic, into European languages, into the modern world, but the Philistines themselves were gone, not annihilated, but assimilated, their Aegean heritage gradually dissolving into the Canaanite, Assyrian, and Babylonian populations around them. So, the Sea Peoples did not win. They did not establish an enduring empire or dynasty. Those among them who settled became something new. Philistines, Sicils, perhaps the kingdoms of northern Syria, and then, in time, vanished into the great currents of history that swept past them. The Hittites vanished. The Mycenaeans vanished. The great commercial cities of Ugarit and Byblos and Sidon were sacked and burned, and in some cases, never rebuilt. Egypt survived, but as a shadow of its former self, its imperial ambitions permanently curtailed. This is the verdict, then. The Sea Peoples were neither heroes nor villains. They were not a singular, coordinated invasion force. They were a consequence. The human debris of a world coming apart at the seams, who then became the instrument of that world's final destruction. They were the symptom, and then they were the catalyst, and then they were absorbed into the new world that rose, slowly and painfully, from the ashes of the old. The Bronze Age collapse is not merely a puzzle for archaeologists. It is a mirror. It asks us to look at our own interconnected, globalized, resource-dependent civilization and wonder, what happens when the web frays? We too face climate instability. We too have complex, brittle supply chains. We too have displaced populations moving across borders, seeking safety and sustenance. We too have institutions that seem, at times, paralyzed in the face of converging crises. The Sea Peoples did not plan to destroy the Bronze Age. They were just trying to survive. And in their struggle to survive, they became the agents of an apocalypse they did not intend and could not control. The ruins of Hattusa and Ugarit and Mycenae do not tell us that all civilizations must fall. They tell us that civilizations can fall when they fail to adapt, when they refuse to acknowledge the fragility of their own systems, when they mistake temporary stability for permanent invincibility. The Sea Peoples came from the sea, but they were born from the land, from its droughts, its famines, its failed politics, and frayed economies. They are not a warning about foreign invaders. They are a warning about internal collapse, about what happens when a society can no longer provide for its own people and, in that failure, creates the very forces that will tear it apart. We will never know the names of the Sea Peoples. They left no literature, no king's lists, no monuments to their own memory. We know them only through the ruins they left behind and the frightened inscriptions of their enemies. They are ghosts in the archaeological record, shadows of a catastrophe that marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. But their story is not over. It never is. It waits, silently, in the tree rings and the pollen cores, in the ash layers and the broken tablets, for us to ask the question again, when the next age of complexity frays, who will take to the seas? And what ruined coast will they, one day, call home? If you've journeyed with us through this story of collapse, resilience, and the ghosts of history, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you don't miss our next investigation into the forgotten corners of our past. This has been For What It's Worth.